Hi guys, I'm Darren and it's that time of year again. Yep, there's a new version of iNav out, so we're going to take a look at what's new in iNav 4.0 for fixed wing. So once again, we're going to follow the same format I did with the last two videos about the new iNav versions. I've written an article on inavfixedwinggroup.com and we're going to basically go through that and have a little discussion about the changes. Now this time I don't think it's going to be too in-depth because a lot of the changes are pretty self-explanatory, but anything does need to have a slightly deeper discussion about, obviously we'll just go into that, and chances are I'll probably blabber on a little bit about it anyway, because I usually end up doing that. Again, I need to apologise, I'm not a waypoint flyer, so the mission stuff and the waypoints I really don't know anything about. So I'm just going to list the changes, and if you're interested you'll probably have to dive deeper into that documentation and check out what's actually happened. It's something that I do plan to sort of learn about so I can share it in a bit more detail with you guys. Right, so there's a few things that we should probably cover before we actually get into it. Now the first one is the last version was 3.0. Why are we now at 4.0? Well, it's explained in the document, but just to briefly cover it, the versioning system has changed in iNav. So before it was basically the major version was increased when, you know, they felt like there were some pretty big changes in there, but now it's moved over to a system called SEMVer, which is semantic versioning. And what that does is have a more structured way to the way that the version numbers work. If I scroll down this page a little bit, you can see that the first digit is the major version number. So in this case, that is 4. Now the major version number will increment every time there's a change that breaks backwards compatibility. Now this might sound quite drastic, but it's happened quite a few times in the past already. So for example, I believe jumping from version 2.4 to 2.5, the mode IDs changed. So if you took your diff of 2.4, put it into 2.5, all the modes will be wrong, and there was actually a conversion tool to get those modes correct. And it's happened with other things like the adjustments. And this time the thing that's changed is there's a few extra things in CLI, but also the fonts are completely different. So if you flash 4.0, look at your OSD and all the fonts look like garbage, it's because you haven't uploaded the correct font. So the major version number will change when compatibility is broken, but again, it's nothing to worry about. The next number along, which is 0 in this case, is the minor version. So this is where new features are added, but it doesn't actually break backwards compatibility. So for example, iNav 4.1 would have new features, but there will be nothing that actually impacts the configurator to iNav firmware communication at all. So all that will work seamlessly, you'll just have extra stuff. Now the last number, which Pavel says will probably never increment, but it is a patch number. So if there is just purely a bug fix, that last number will increment. So we could perhaps have theoretically an iNav 4.0.1, which will just fix some bugs that were found in 4.0, if there are any. So that's the versioning numbers. Another thing that's happened is iNav versions have been given names. So iNav 4.0 has been given the version name Red Kite. This is something that Pavel's introduced. Personally, I don't really know how to take it. I know EdgeTX have named some of their versions. So 2.5 is called Dauntless, which to be honest sounds a bit pretentious to me. But also I had an email from Stewie. We were talking about a few things and he mentioned the version names and how it just adds another level of confusion to things. And I sort of agree with him. I mean, when does the version name change? Is it only with the major versions? So, you know, iNav 5.0 we call Blue Tit or something like that. What about minor versions? What happens there? Do we have iNav Red Kite 4.1? It's just adding an extra thing you don't really need. It's a bit over. That's my view anyway. I'd rather just stick with a version number. It may sound a bit clinical, but at least you know what you're dealing with, rather than say maybe down the road we have someone who says I've got a problem with iNav Red Kite. It's not doing this, this and this, and then we have to sort of go and say, well, what version are you using? Is it, oh, 4.2? You know, it's just, yeah, that's my point of view. Leave a comment below and let me know what your thoughts are on the version name. But anyway, let's get back to iNav 4.0 and see what changes have been introduced. So we've covered the version numbers, and like I said, I'm just going to go through this document. So the way I've set this out is the usual way for me is I've got a few categories to group up some of these pull requests. Each one is listed and I've included the pull request number. So you should be able to have a look at this and check out more detail. So this one is pretty self-explanatory. It adds Azimuth to SmartPort telemetry, just in case that's something useful for you guys with antenna trackers. But yeah, if you're interested in knowing more about what it does, then just click this. So let's just have a quick look at this. As I say, most of it is pretty self-explanatory, so we don't need to dive in too deep. So I've already mentioned SmartPort now has Azimuth as a telemetry sensor. PPM receivers have been dropped from iNav 4.0, and the reasoning behind that is you need to sort of balance stuff that is still relevant and the space you have to store stuff on the flight controller. Things have already been removed for F411 and F722 MCUs, and we'll cover that later. But there is a sort of balancing act, and the fact is PPM is quite old now. As far as I know, it's not really supported as a major communication protocol for any of the current systems. They all use serial based now. So yeah, it may be that you have some craft with an older receiver in there, but you just have to stick with iNav 3.0, unfortunately, for those craft, which is a bit of a pain because there are some nice features in 4.0, but again, you have to move with the times. I mean, stuff like Dragon Link, you can use S-Bus, so I think it is really only stuff that's no longer supported, like the Immersion RC, Easy UHF, where they've not actually supported that for years now, so there's no update to put a different protocol on there. Let's get on with the rest of the list. So 50 milliwatt has been added to the Crossfire protocol, and I believe that's for ELRS. Trip distance added to JETI telemetry. The Crossfire RSSI and LQ has been fixed, and there's also a fix for SmartAudio over SoftSerial. Now, this is a strange one because a lot of people, it just worked fine anyway, but someone had a problem with it using omnibus flight controllers, and this person had a look at it, and it wasn't actually transmitting based on the specification by TBS. So they added a fix to get it so that it was within specification. It was working fine on their omnibus with their VTX. But then Leslie from the iNav Fixed Wing group had a problem with his TBS VTX using this new system in RC1. So there's basically a system to be able to switch that on or off. So let's have a quick look at this one. So this is the problem. It was with a Holybro ATL V2 VTX on an Omnibus F4, and that was where the SmartAudio wasn't working correctly over SoftSerial. So he added the code in, got it all working, and if we have a look, basically the original code, if you're using SoftSerial, it would just jump out, but if you weren't using SoftSerial, it would send 0x00, which basically is something to identify the start of the stream. So basically, he was just sending that for everything. But for some reason that caused problems with other VTXs, like the genuine TBS one, even though that's now set up to spec. So what was added was this CLI option, VTX SmartAudio alternate method. Now, by default, that is turned on because that is using the old way of doing it. So by default, it's on. If your SmartAudio worked over SoftSerial on older versions, it will still work now. But if you're trying to do SmartAudio over SoftSerial and it doesn't work, you can try turning this off in the CLI, and it will use the new method where it sends that bit of data down the stream first, which is what TBS actually specify. So it gives a couple of options, but people who are successful on the older system, it won't break it for you. So the next section is the OSD. We now have seconds on display in the clock. We have a message shown when you're calibrating the compass. Now this is quite a handy one because it will try and prevent people from doing Autotune incorrectly. Some people have tried to do it in manual, which just doesn't do anything at all. So if you try to do Autotune in manual, it will show a message on the screen to switch to acro. So that's quite a good thing. Maybe in all honesty, it should be on all modes other than acro. But yeah, this is an improvement nonetheless. There's improvements to the DJI OSD, including additional things on the name pack. Again, it's still really just a hack, because ultimately it would be great if DJI supported the Canvas OSD, which will basically give you everything on the current OSD. So if you want to check that out, you can have a look in this pull request here. But it also does add the option to do some in-flight adjustments, which is really handy for in-flight tuning. Proper RSSI percentage for Crossfire. Right, UK units have been corrected so that they're actually in line with transportation in the UK. I will cover that later because there's quite a big section on it. And also the GA units, I will also cover that later as well. There is now a symbol added to VTX power. Previously, you just had a number, which, to be honest, just having a number is pretty meaningless. So now there is a little VTX symbol followed by a number. There is now a top speed element added to the OSD. So this is on 3D speed, GPS speed, airspeed. Each one can have a top speed. You can see your maximum speed throughout the whole flight in the OSD if you want to. Battery symbol has been added to the battery percentage. Again, just having a number and a percent again is pretty meaningless. So now there is also the battery symbol in front, which does actually decrease as the battery capacity decreases as well. There is an average speed added to the stats screen at the end. So this is basically the whole flight, the average speed for that flight. So it's probably useful for economy stats, that sort of thing, if you're interested in that. There are alarms now for minimum and maximum airspeed that you can set. So the alarms are down the right-hand side of the screen, and it allows you to set a value which it will start blinking. So maybe if you want to set the low one to just above stall speed, it will just blink for speed when it crosses that alarm threshold. And finally, we can set precision for the RPM. So before it was basically two numbers and a K. So you had, thousands of RPM and that was it. Now you can actually choose how precise you want it. Now you can actually set the ESC RPM precision in Configurator. So if I click this to make it a bit bigger, it's just that drop down list there. That's mainly for people that are pushing speed. They want to be able to calculate everything better, so they can get all this information now. So that's it for the OSD changes. All right, so these are some general changes. Right, I mentioned this briefly earlier, but there are feature cuts for the F411 and F722 boards. And going forward, they will probably have more features cut as things go on. If more features are added to the firmware that take up more space, there has to be like a balancing act between what features would be beneficial to have and which ones need to be sacrificed so that they fit on the flight controller. And it is just a case of the F722 and F411 only have 512 kilobytes of flash memory. Above that, you have like the F405s and others which have 1 or 2 megabytes. So those ones are absolutely fine. But F411 and F722, unless you're happy with the features that are cut not being there, then you probably want to avoid those flight controllers. Right, so the next thing we have is fixed wing soaring mode, which is a flight mode modifier. And what that will do is basically, if you're in course hold, cruise, position hold, it will allow a little bit of movement of the plane, so it won't automatically just correct it to keep it dead level. So it will be able to just go with the air currents and just hopefully get you better flight times while soaring. Ultimately, position hold will allow drift so that it can follow thermals, that sort of thing, but hopefully that's something that will come in the future. It's not in there at the moment. But what it will do is enable the craft to float within the air current. So that's always a good thing if you're flying a glider. Other general changes, you can now have spaces at the start of the craft name if you want. There's a fix for I2C errors after 72 minutes of on time. Unused ESC protocols have been removed. There is support now for the Bosch BMI270 accelerometer and gyro. The board documents have been moved to their own folder. Let's have a look at that. because the documents is something that people don't really know where it is, but they are quite handy and hopefully they're kept up to date. So if we look at the iNav GitHub, we have this wiki area, which I'll open in a new tab, which does have some detailed guides, but there's also this docs area here. Now all this is more sort of technical, related to the individual parts of the firmware. So for example, you have settings.md, which basically lists every single command in the CLI. So if you're after a CLI command, you can search this page and find it. And that's generated automatically, so that does literally have everything for the CLI. But all the flight controller boards used to be in here too. They've now been moved into this boards folder, so it's just more accessible. This is just a useful area that will show you which targets are available on which flight controllers and what the different targets do. So that's what the boards documents are about. Manual expo has finally been changed from 70% to 35%, which is a much more realistic expo for fixed wing. 70-80% is generally what you have on sort of, you probably can't see it up there, but the extra 3D planes, which have barn door control surfaces that deflect 60 plus degrees. Expo at 70% really isn't needed for most regular aircraft. So 35 should be plenty. You may even want to reduce it further, but this should be a safe number for any aircraft that has the control surfaces set correctly. Right, multi-rotor modes have been removed from planes. It's listed in the firmware section because that's where the change actually takes place, but you'll notice it more in Configurator. You won't have the multi-rotor modes showing if you have a fixed wing model selected on the modes page. And then LED strip issues on the H7 boards has been fixed. So that's the general changes. Now we're moving into a bit more of the advanced stuff. So this is changes related to tuning and programming, that sort of things. Right, so finally you can change profiles in iNav. You could always do it on the ground with a stick command, but you couldn't do it in flight. There was an adjustment to change the profile, but it didn't actually do anything. There was no code behind it whatsoever. It was something, if you set it up, it wouldn't work and you'd think, what's going on here? But now changing profiles is working and is active. I mentioned Stewie earlier when I was talking about the version names, and he was actually the second person to test this in flight. I checked it basically in flight myself, and then Stewie also tested it because the way he flies, it's something that he really, really wanted. If you don't know Stewie, he makes absolutely awesome videos of basically taking EDF jets and flying them down the side of a mountain. And obviously the different speeds, you want different profiles. So he's really happy about this change. And the way that it works is through the iNav programming. It's not an adjustment at all. That's been removed from adjustments completely because it didn't do anything anyway. But the way you set this up is with programming. So this one here has an example of how it works. And it's quite simple, really. This is a really basic one using a switch. The global variable set here was literally just to show me which profile was active at the time, because at that point there wasn't an OSD element, but there is in the final release. And again, I just set up a simple 3-position switch to just change the profile. The switch could be anything. You could change it based on flight mode, you could change it based on airspeed. The choice is yours. So this could be really useful eventually if you're working on something like a VTOL, where you have a switch over position from the quad profile over to the fixed wing profile. So there's a lot of scope for this, which is why it's much better suited in programming. But you can see it's really simple. All you need to do is have an activating condition. So on this one, the mid channel is selected on the switch. So that means logic condition 2 here is active, and that sets the profile to profile number 2, which if you look up here, it is set to profile number 2. Like I mentioned, you don't need to do this part anymore. There is an icon in the OSD which has basically a little file folder with P on it for profiles. and then the profile number. So if you have a tuning OSD, you can stick that up in somewhere, and then you know which profile you're working on at the time. There's also this PR here, which adds the option to change the battery profile when you change the flight profile. So this is more useful for if you have a craft where you use different types of battery, and each battery obviously weighs differently, so you might want it tuned slightly differently. It's not really useful in flight, but if you have a craft set up with multiple batteries, or you might want different PIDs for those. So they are the profile changes. Right, next up we have Autotune. So a big change for Autotune is that it no longer tunes P and I. The reason for this is because of the improvements in iNav 3.0, quite frankly. In iNav 3.0, it added tuning of the rates, which is a massive, massive thing that, to be honest, before iNav 3.0 was overlooked a hell of a lot. You'd see people having all sorts of issues simply because the rates were too high. But by now setting the rates, the feed forward basing on the rates, the way that the P and I were tuned weren't really correct. And what you could notice was models being tuned, but the P and I being way too high for what it should have been. So what has happened now instead is that there are base P and I values that should be fine for pretty much everything. Obviously, it won't get everything locked in, but it will be good for a starting point. So the idea is you go up, you auto tune in acro still. This sets the rates and the feed forward. And once they're set, you do an in-flight tune to get it just fine-tuned and nailed to however you like your flying style to be. If you're a more relaxed pilot, you will probably have less P&I. But if you want it more locked in, you would obviously increase the P&I. Also, there is derivative added by default too. So again, you can tune derivative when you do your manual tune. Maybe in the future there will be an auto tune again which tunes P, I and D as well as the rates and FF, but it may be a multi-stage thing. It's something that's sort of being bandied about, but at the moment this is the way to do it. Get your auto tune done for your rates and feed forward, then tune the P, I and D to your liking. And Mark Hoffman has an awesome video on exactly how to do this, so I'll put a link in the description for that. While I mention it, of course, there will be a link in the description to this document too. Right, so these are just other random things that are in the advanced, the tuning or the programming changes. Right, so I've repeated the show message switch to acro when auto tune is enabled in manual. We covered that one earlier. Autotune's target deflection rate is now 80% instead of 90%, and that's to give the stabilization a little bit more room, and it will also hopefully not get your feed forward up too high. Again, if you see really high feed forward values like 250 or whatever, you're probably not got enough surface deflection on your control surfaces. You want to increase them physically a little bit and then do another auto tune. Or you could maybe try changing the mixer. For example, if you have an elevon set up and your roll has a really low feed forward, but your pitch has a really high feed forward, what you could do is slightly change the percentages so that the roll has less throw, but the pitch has more throw, and then try an auto tune again. But if you see really high feed forward rates, you need to sort out the physical control surfaces. Allow PT2 and PT3 filters on D term. I'm not overly up with the whole filtering side. Tuning and filtering is something I never really bothered with in the past. I'm getting a lot better with the tuning, but I still need to look into filtering. And finally, something that someone asked for, which was loiter radius to be changed with the programming. Now, the reason this came about is because they basically wanted a massive loiter radius. That I think they were asking for about 2 kilometers or a kilometer, something like that, ridiculously big. And having big loiter radiuses like that settable in the advanced tuning really isn't what that's all about. The loiter radius in advanced tuning is literally just to circle your craft quite close in, just so that you don't actually lose or gain too much distance. Whether that's for landing or whether it's for circling while you get yourself a drink, it doesn't matter, but you just don't want it to be massive radius. You want it to be, 70 meters. Just so that it's a nice tight circle and it keeps the plane in one spot. The reason people wanted a big loiter radius was, or one of the reasons, was so that they could practice chasing the aircraft. So what the solution that I came up with is to have it settable in programming. So the maximum radius is 1 kilometer, which means that you could have your model doing a 2 kilometer circle in the sky, which, you know, is absolutely plenty. If you try to set it over that, then it will just do the kilometer radius. So the way this works, I've done an example on the screen. The yellow area is just showing a simple loiter radius on the switch. You can see I'm trying to put in 10 kilometers, but that will just drop down to 1 kilometer within the iNav firmware, so it can't physically go over that threshold. But let's open this up so you can just see it's on a switch. When the switch is active, the loiter radius will be 1 kilometer. When you deactivate it, it goes back to the default of whatever you've got set on the advanced tuning page. The purple area is how it can be set up on a pot. So you can vary the loiter radius with your pot. So for this, I've also added a switch to activate it. So when the switch is in the middle position, it will use the pot. And this here is just showing how you can scale the microsecond value on the pot. I can't remember what I actually got this up to, but you can play about with this code to get yourself whatever results you want. And then again, override only when the switch is in the correct position. The green is just showing the loiter radius in a global variable, so you can have it on screen. There's no OSD element for this, so if you did want to show the loiter radius on screen, you would need to do it with this programming. But basically, you can now read the loiter radius from the flight controller, just dividing it by 100, so that is the loiter radius in meters. There are a couple of safety things thrown in here, so the loiter radius in the programming will only be active when you have the switch position active. Of course, you could just set it to permanently do it, but I really wouldn't recommend that at all. Also, the minimum loiter radius is limited by the loiter radius you set in the advanced tuning page. So if you have a 70 meter loiter radius in advanced tuning, then try to set this below 70 meters. It will stop at the 70 meters. So there are a few safety things built in there, but this should give plenty of options to have the plane loitering as you want it for whatever purpose you want. So next up, we have automated flight and waypoint missions. So the first thing that I have listed here is this 2-stage climb first, return to home. Originally, if you had a climb first, return to home, it would climb up until it reaches the return to home altitude, then it will turn around and come back. What this does is climb up to the first stage altitude, then it will turn around, and then it will continue climbing up on the way back home. I've actually done a video on return to home, so I'll put a link in the top corner. I cover this in a lot more detail there, but it basically gives you a lot more options if you want to use the climb first, return to home. And also I've added it into the wiki, so you can check that all out here. There's also nice pictures explaining what all the different return to homes do. So this is a standard climb first. You can see it goes up to altitude, turns, comes back. And then the first stage climbs up to the first stage altitude, turns, then climbs up to the return to home altitude. And it also works with spiral climb. So you can spiral up to the first stage altitude, turn to home, and then climb up the rest of the way on the way back. Now, most of this stuff is waypoint. So again, sorry about this, but I'm just going to list what you can now do. So you can have multiple waypoint missions on your flight controller, and you can obviously select which mission you want to use. You can have a home waypoint option. You can choose to restart the mission. You can have in-flight waypoint planning, which is pretty cool. Again, I've not really read how to do this, but I guess you just have it on a switch, so that when you get to a point, you just use the switch to mark where you are, and that will save the position. The waypoint finished message has been improved on the OSD. There is now the ability to override arming block if a waypoint is too far away. Fixed wing emergency landing vertical control rate has been overhauled. Constrain launch throttle to the global limit. So if you say have a throttle limit of 70%, the launch throttle will only go up to that 70%. I guess this is for setups that have more pitchy props or whatever on than their motor can really handle for efficiency when they're cruising, but they just don't want to burn out on launch. So this will constrain that throttle limit to the launch. There's a failsafe fix for a waypoint failsafe fix for return to home. So basically, if you have failsafe off, so if you want to do a mission, turn your radio off, if you have a waypoint set up to return to home, it will still do the return to home rather than trying to failsafe. I guess that was what was happening in rare cases, but this is fixed now. The maximum number of waypoints has been increased to 120. There's a mission loaded message shown before you arm. So if you put the goggles on and it won't arm, there will be a message saying that there is a waypoint mission loaded. So you can either unload it, bypass it to get your craft armed and flying. Right, there are some new and updated targets. So I'm not really going to go through all those. There is something of note though, so F7 and H7 targets, the MSC now works on Windows. It was broken before, but that's working. So you can directly access the SD card on the flight controller on those processors without having issues now. And the SPL06 Baro has been added to all Matek targets. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because people are reporting issues on iNav with boards that have a DSP 310 Baro. Basically, it's selecting the SPL06 Baro instead of the DSP 310. And the reason for that is both of those bits of hardware have the same ID. So iNav doesn't actually have a clue which one you've got because they both have the same physical ID. It seems like they are pretty compatible, but if you know that the flight controller should have a DSP 310, just select that from the list. It's not something that we can fix in iNav. It's, you know, unless they physically change the ID of the barometer, there's nothing we can really do. If that happens, just choose the correct one from the list, save, and you're all good. Right, configurator changes. Now, this is something that people have been, to be frank, whinging about for a long time. This is the units used in iNav Configurator. Now, previously, it's always used the units that are used on the firmware, but people, you know, want to use meters, or some people may even want to use imperial. I know it's frowned upon by a lot of people. But, you know, nevertheless, people like working with what they're used to, so why not give them the choice? So this has been added now into iNav Configurator. So if I open this in a new window, we may have an example. That is the wrong PR. I need to update that. So, sorry, guys. So here we go. I'll make sure that I update the link in the document. There isn't really an image of it working, but it's quite simple. All you need to do, up in the top corner, you have a little gear icon. If you open that, you will get an option to choose which units you want to use. The units you can select from are none, which uses the default firmware unit, so centimeters or, you know, all that good stuff. You can use metric, which will use units such as meters. You can use imperial units, which is obviously feet and miles per hour, that sort of thing. And you can also select OSD, and what this will do is use whatever units you've got set up on your OSD. So if you're using metric, imperial, metric and miles per hour, UK or general aviation, it will use those units in Configurator. Now at the moment this is only set up on the advanced tuning page, but it will be moved onto any other page that needs it going forward. Hopefully you guys will enjoy that. Me personally, I leave it on none. I still use centimeters and everything, but that's what I'm used to. Right, changes to the modes page. Now, let me just bring up the image because it will be quicker. Right, so first of all, you can see we have this hide unused modes button. And what that will do is, for example, pre-arm, course hold, I'm not using those. If I click that button, they disappear. You only see the modes that you're using. So less clutter on the screen, easier to double check what you've got set up on your switches. So really nice touch. Also what we have that is pretty obvious are these blue bars across, which are separating out the different types of modes. So we have arming modes, flight modes, navigation modes. Further down we will have modifiers, and there's a few different sections to separate it out exactly what the functionality is. Another thing that you may have noticed is this dark blue box here. Now you may be used to iNav having this light blue box like you can see on horizon, and traditionally what that blue box has always done is when your switch is in that position, it will light up if it can to show that that mode will work. Now notice I said if it can, because it will only do it if the flight controller can enter that mode at the time. If we look back at nav cruise on that screen, you can see it's a dark blue, and the reason for that is iNav can't get into nav cruise unless it's flying. So you can see that our switch is in the correct position for nav cruise to work, so we have this dark blue box to now show us that the switch is in the right place even though iNav can't get into that mode. And finally, what we have down here is an acro indicator. Now this is, again, is something that's been missing since the dawn of time. How do you know when you're in acro? And it's easy enough for people to say, well, it's when you've got no other flight modes selected. So if you have no flight mode selected and no navigation mode selected, then acro is active. That's the way it was sort of inherited from clean flight and beta flight. But basically on a quad, how many modes do you have? It's like you have basically angle and horizon. That's it. There's no other flight modes. You don't have manual. You may have now like a return to home, but you get my point. There's not a lot of data there to look through. Whereas with iNav, we're only listing half of the navigation modes on this screen. So there's a lot more to double check. Now it's nice and easy. If you can be an acro, this will light up. So there's no second guessing or anything like that. It's easy to spot. Let's get on to the units. Now this is obviously what you see in your OSD. And the first one I'm going to mention is UK. If you used to use UK in iNav 3.0 or below, you will notice when you go to your OSD page that you're now using a unit called Metric MPH. That's because basically the old UK units weren't really UK units. They were metric units but using miles per hour for the speed. Everything else was in metric, and to be honest, that's not what we use in the UK. If we're driving our cars on the road, we don't see things in kilometers. We see things in miles. They're not the correct unit, so that's why this has been updated. Don't worry, if you liked using the old one, as I say, you'll still be using it, and it will be using it out the box. You'll have meters per second for the vario, meters and kilometers for distance, milliamp hours per kilometer or watt hours per kilometer for economy, and temperature in Celsius, but the speed will be in miles per hour. Hence the name Metric MPH. That's a pretty good descriptor for what those units are. UK units have actually changed to what we're used to in the UK. So we have miles per hour for speed still, we have feet per second for the vario, we have distances in feet and miles. Actually, that should be altitude in feet. Sorry, I need to update that document. The altitude will be in feet, not miles. And we have milliamp hour and watt hour per mile, and temperature is still obviously Celsius. So yeah, other than that, which I need to change in the document, which should be feet, that's what the UK units look like, and that's basically what we're more used to. And a lot of people say, well, you should just change, but no, sod you guys, sorry. If you drive and you're used to it, you understand how long it takes to do a mile, how far a mile is. You could tell me it's so ever many kilometers away, I wouldn't have a clue in scale, because that's just not what I'm used to. Don't get me wrong, I completely agree that multiplication, addition, anything like that is so much better with metric. There's no doubt about that. But this isn't about that. This is about seeing what you're used to. In the same respect, a new set of units have been created for general aviation users. And this is something that was requested as well. So before implementing this, I actually spoke with a few general aviation pilots to see what type of units they used. And they either used SI, which is metric, or they would use units like this. So they have speed in knots, we have altitude in feet, we have the variometer in 100 feet per minute, and we have the distance Usually they just use nautical miles, but we're obviously on a smaller scale. We do need a slightly smaller unit. So I've taken a compromise here. So we have feet up to a certain point, and then after that it's nautical miles. And we have milliamp hour and watt hour per nautical mile. Temperature, again, it depends on where you live, but it seems like most general aviation pilots are using Celsius, so we stuck with that. But it's a unit set for general aviation pilots if they choose to use it. This is about making iNav better for people, not for standards. Why should everyone use metric all the time? Right, so mission control, there are lots and lots of changes in mission control. Again, I don't use it, so please feel free to go through this. But some of the changes are going to be towards using the multiple missions. There's some terrain data, there are some just general updates. But if you go through these PRs here, you'll have all the information you need for the changes in 4.0 for mission control. So finally, we get on to the other changes in Configurator. So the presets tab has been removed. And why? Because it wasn't really used as intended. So we had a couple of really old presets which hadn't been updated in a long time. The idea originally was someone got a plug and play plane and put the presets up, and you get quite a nice long list for all different models, which would get a base tuning that's working pretty well. But it never really happened. We had about maybe 4 or 5 presets, and they'd been in there for a fair while now. But also, the way Autotune has improved, we don't really need them. We have a really nice base set of PIDs. We actually tune the rates and the feed forward to our model, which is the most important parts. And we get something that's going to fly decent. We can obviously tune it a bit further if we wish, but there's no real need for a presets tab anymore. The preset is out the box, so don't worry about it. Just choose the type of aircraft that you have, whether it has a tail or whether it doesn't have a tail, and then just go through the auto tune process and then fine tune later in flight. So next up we have hovering over an OSD element shows its name. Now what that does is literally this. If you hover over it, it will show the actual name of the element so you can look it up. Obviously it will highlight here as well still, so if we hover over that you can see sag compensated battery voltage, so it makes things easier to edit. That's about it. Fixed wing mixer image fixed. If you had a flying wing setup, your elevon setup, the numbers were incorrect on this image. They are now fixed. Air mode settings removed from PID tuning mechanics. That is basically, this might still have them on because I don't actually know which version of 4.0 this is. So yeah, they're gone. You did have things to change air mode, how air mode works in here, but you don't really need to touch it, to be honest. GPS speed to change to ground speed for consistency. Again, this only affected the OSD page. Yeah, this used to be called GPS speed. It's now called ground speed, just to make it more consistent. Default PID FF settings changed for fixed wing, and iNav 4.0 Autotune changes. So again, I mentioned that briefly earlier. We have new PID settings by default for fixed wing, and we also have a slightly different Autotune. You notice that it was an 80% target instead of 90% now. And finally, we have quite a last minute change, which is to block people from making changes while the defaults were being applied. So when you first plug in the flight controller, of course, if you've done an update, you get this box here. Now, if I clicked any of these, what you'll notice is, I know it will do it on this version actually. So if I click airplane without a tail, I can actually just change anything here. I can go into configuration, change settings, do whatever. At this point, it is still setting up the defaults before doing this reboot. In iNav 4.0 release, this doesn't happen. You get a box up saying that it's setting the defaults, then it says rebooting. There is a slight bug with that, which will be fixed in the next release, where if you choose keep current settings, it will just sit there. What you need to do is close Configurator down and relaunch it, but that has been fixed. It was something that was overlooked. So that is all the changes that affect fixed wing in iNav 4.0 that I've noted. There could be others that have slipped through, but these are the ones of note. If you want to see a full list, you have the firmware and the configurator pull requests here, and this will use the iNav 4.0 milestone to get up those pull requests. So that will include all the quadcopter stuff as well. So I hope you guys found this video useful. I hope you have a wonderful Christmas and a very happy New Year. See you soon. Flying models like you stole them, guys.